Okay, so my name is Nate Moyer, and this is my part 2 oral presentation for exam 1 in wildlife behavior 8100. So I'm just going to start right off the bat with question number 1, talking about Tinbergen's 4 questions for understanding wildlife behavior. And to really answer this question of kind of talking about the 4 questions being function, evolution, causation, and development, and which ones are proximate and which ones are ultimate, we're going to look at a specific example here with the eastern rat snake. So the eastern rat snake is a large colubrid species, non-venomous, native to the eastern United States. They're one of my favorite species to encounter and work with in the wild. This here is a juvenile, so over time they lose that kind of mottled pattern and develop a very dark brown to black pattern with a white belly as they get older. So looking at these 4 questions, function, evolution, causation, and development, they really answer the questions why, what, and how. And talking about which of these are ultimate or proximate, the first 2, function and evolution, really are ultimate questions. And so kind of looking at the overall, how did this happen over a long period of time, evolutionarily speaking, why did this come about, all of that stuff. Whereas proximate questions are causation and development, that number 3 and number 4. And really what that's looking at is the immediate, the here and now of that behavior and how and why did it occur for this individual animal. And so looking at the function of the behavior of the eastern rat snake, what I wanted to highlight is the common behavior of a lot of colubrid snakes, especially juveniles, to mimic a rattlesnake by shaking or vibrating the tip of their tail extremely fast and banging it up against like dried leaves especially, but rocks, sticks, anything like that, to emit the sound that mimics a rattlesnake. And so if we look at breaking down that behavior into these 4 questions, the function, that why question, why is this behavior exhibited across species, but in the eastern rat snake as well? And really, it's for survival and protection against predation. And so that mimicry, and the animal hears that sound, thinks it's a rattlesnake, and chooses not to partake in eating that snake. Talking about evolution, how does something like this come about? And chances are for a trait like this just occurred from natural selection. So a certain demographic of snake may have had a genetic code or gene in their DNA that coded for maybe being more anxious, being more prone to wanting to protect and defend itself, and therefore it just may have naturally started to shake, similar to that adrenaline rush that people feel in that fight or flight response. And so its tail may have just shaken, and ultimately that predator ended up walking away. And that snake just had that disposition, that genetic code, eventually survived because it wasn't eaten, and passed that on to its predecessors. But if we look at the kind of immediate or proximate causation, okay, of what exhibited this response in the snake, and really it is the presence of a predator. And looking at development, how did this develop in this individual animal? Was it a learned behavior from a parent? Was it a learned behavior from an experience, or is it more genetic? And in this case, it's probably more genetic, seeing how snakes are solitary creatures, especially eastern rat snakes. They will, females will incubate their eggs and then leave upon the eggs hatching. And so it's not really something that a juvenile snake would have learned from its mother. Now, getting into question number 2, talking about how hormones affect behavior. I want to talk about the difference between organizational effects and activational effects. And really, the biggest difference here is kind of the timeline as to when the hormones affect the behavior. And so, looking at organizational effects, really what we're looking at is the neural development and thus behavioral development of an animal based on hormone exposure early in their life. And so, as they are exposed to different hormones, that kind of develops their behavior early on, which thus ultimately develops their neural pathways and development throughout their entire life. An example of this that I chose is within honeybee populations. And so hormone production and hormone exposure to young larvae within a honeycomb affects the role of that bee within the colony. And so if a colony is trying to rear up a queen, they are going to expose that larva to certain hormones in order for her to develop into a queen. Similarly, depending on what those worker bees are going to do, or I should say what those bees are going to become, whether it's a worker, a drone, or anything like that, they are going to also be exposed to those hormones, and that kind of sets that bee up for their life as they develop into that role. Whereas activational effects is kind of the immediate development or change of a neural pathway and thus behavior based on hormone levels at a certain stage in their life, such as the onset of puberty or the onset of sexual maturity. An example I chose for activational hormone effect is white-tailed deer and the rut. So I'm a big hunter, live in rural central Pennsylvania, and white-tailed deer every fall, usually around mid to end October, will go into what we call the rut. And so, in other words, this is a time when all of their behavior changes because of the flood and the rush of hormones in their body. And so it causes a bunch of different physiological effects, such as higher levels of aggression, spreading scent and pheromones wherever they go, rubbing up against different things, sniffing different things, as well as just putting on weight, putting on bulk. Their neck gets a lot thicker. And really what that is it plays into kind of that behavioral change then too. They become much more solitary. So in the summer, I can often see multiple buck kind of traveling together. And then once the rut hits, they all split up to go find their doe. They're constantly chasing doe. They tend to be, in layman's terms, stupider. It's a lot easier to hunt a buck in the rut than it is after the rut because they're a lot less cautious. They're kind of just crazy about them doe, but they're also much more aggressive. And so talking about that thickened neck, what that prepares them for is for them to fight other male deer or other buck in the area. So hopping into question number 3, looking at the two main types of behavioral studies, cross-sectional and longitudinal, really the differences, I'm going to talk first about cross-sectional studies, and what cross-sectional studies are really looking at is a specific point in time of an animal or a group of animals, a demographic at a certain time. Whereas longitudinal, and we'll look at an example here in a second, but they are more so long-term, looking at the long-term effects following an individual or a group of individuals over a long period of time and looking at how their behavior changes or does not change over that time. So first, talking about cross-sectional studies, some of the advantages and disadvantages of these studies include the amount of resources needed to perform them. Oftentimes, cross-sectional studies are much less labor-intensive, don't require as much manpower, and are oftentimes easier and faster to produce data because you're looking at it over a short period of time. And an example study that I chose for a cross-sectional study was a study that was looking at forage behavior and how that affects nest architecture between two different species of ants, and that is the Burns pyramid ant as well as the shoot a duck. I forget the common name, but I remember the Latin name was like Durgens elegans or something like that. Both common or not really common. The pyramid ant is a very common species of ant in Florida, whereas the elegans ant was a little more rare. But this study really looked at how does that foraging behavior affect how the behavior of a nest is built within these ant colonies. And so the objective there was really to compare the species of ants and find out if their foraging behavior did indeed affect how they built those nests. And you can see my citation there for that. Now, diving into the longitudinal studies, so really once again, these are for kind of long-term studies looking at behavior over time. An advantage to this is you often get much richer data. You also get much more data. Disadvantages to these studies is they take a lot more time, a lot more manpower, and a lot more expenses because of that. So they're a lot harder to accomplish. One study that I chose for this is looking at a review study of the long-term kind of behavioral insights of studying mammalian carnivores. And so this was, like I said, a review study. It looked at a bunch of different carnivores, specifically like lions. And really what it was talking about is the insights of that longitudinal study, because mammalian carnivores live a long time. And they're a little harder to study their behavior on the short term. And so they're almost a species that must be studied over the long term in these longitudinal studies. And really what this review study was looking at is the evolutionary behavior regarding cooperation and social dynamics within these mammalian carnivores. And kind of the insights of these different studies going there. So to answer question number 4, looking at animal communication and the different types of communication. We talked about cooperative signaling, dishonest signaling, incidental signaling, as well as spiteful signaling. And I have 4 examples here of different animals that kind of exhibit those different types of communication. So the first one I want to start with is cooperative signaling. And the example I chose is meerkats. And so if you look at meerkats as an example, they are signaling and communicating to one another in cooperation. And so like you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, or vice versa. And really this is helpful primarily for avoiding predation. And so meerkats will oftentimes colonize and then have lookouts and look for predators, and they will communicate to one another to avoid predation. An example of dishonest signaling, in other words, when an animal kind of lies, if you will, about them or a behavior or something like that in order to avoid predation, avoid detection, or something like that, is in green tree frogs. Another common species found in the eastern United States. They're a small tree frog. My daughter and I like catching them in the summer when we go down to the beach in North Carolina. But one thing that green tree frogs have been found to do is to actually lower their croak, or their voice, if you will, in order to mimic larger frogs, thus hopefully avoiding predation from certain predators. An example of an incidental or a cue from an animal, in other words, this is kind of an accidental, if you will. The animal is not trying to signal another animal, but it might be helpful to the receiver. Is in mourning doves. So if you have ever experienced a mourning dove taking off near you and you immediately hear this like whistle, that is not actually them calling or anything like that. It is actually wind or air moving through their feathers and thus creating that kind of whistling sound as they take off. And really, they're not trying to communicate to one another or anything like that. But it does tell any other bird, mourning dove, or any other bird, even people in the area, that there is something there that is startling them. In the case of, if we hear it as people, it's usually us. We are the thing that is startling them. But in this case, the sender doesn't really receive any benefit except for them to escape, whereas the receiver definitely receives a benefit in just being forewarned about that. I guess to jump back for cooperative signaling, both the sender and the receiver are benefited from it. Dishonest signaling, the sender is benefited, the receiver is deceived through the lie. And then as far as spiteful signaling, this can actually be detrimental to both the sender and the receiver in certain situations. The example I chose is in the red fire ant. There have been studies that have shown that red fire ants have actually a spike gene that they will kill other fire ants, especially other queens, if they lack that gene. And this can be both beneficial or detrimental for the red fire ants. Of course, for the receiver, it is definitely detrimental because the red fire ants will actually kill them. But as far as the sender goes, it could be helpful if they have enough in the colony that they don't kill everyone off. As in, if the queen, like if there are enough queens that have this spike gene that they want to let live, then all is well. However, if none of the offspring or future queens possess this gene and they kill off the future of the colony, then that can definitely be detrimental. And then last but not least, diving into question number 5. This was actually a pretty fun study to look at. Yes, it was sad to read about because polar bears are being displaced by ice loss, but I think it is cool to see how some polar bears are adapting to that change. And so really looking at this study, it looked at specifically polar bears and common eiders, which is a common shorebird or a common seabird within kind of the East Coast and up into Canada. And this specifically was looking at a small island in Nunavut, Canada. And the purpose of this study was to assess the consequences of a polar bear's behavior change to going from hunting seals out, like miles out on the ice, and moving inland then and feeding on nests of these common eiders. And so how this study was done, the methods that were used, the researchers used drones to capture polar bear behavior. As polar bears were being seen on the mainland, they would send these drones out and essentially record the polar bears eating. And how they calculated the polar bear's benefit was based on 3 things: the number of nests that they ate in a single sitting, the average number of eggs that were in a nest, and the bioavailability of the nutrients, or the ability of the polar bear to absorb the protein and the fats of those eggs. And ultimately, what this study found is that bears do indeed benefit from this behavior change, respectively. And so talking about what happened in the study is early in the season, when these common eiders were nesting, the earliest bears that came, nests were plentiful, eggs were everywhere, and those bears were finding eggs and eating a lot of eggs. It was really easy to find them. They didn't have to walk far. And so for those early bears, they were definitely benefiting from this change in behavior energy-wise. So for all of the energy that they were exerting, they were definitely gaining it back. However, as the season went on and the number of nests were being depleted because the polar bears were eating them, bears that were late in the game may have swam inland. However, they did not get enough energy for that to be beneficial. And so it really begs the question, like, is this something that can sustain the species long term as we continue to lose sea ice, or is this just a way to put a band-aid on the sucking chest wound, if you will, of climate change and habitat loss? So yeah, thanks for listening and participating in my exam number 1, part 2.